Well, hello and welcome to another Sunday morning coffee with Dr. Childress. Today, I'm going to be discussing the role of the protective other in this pathology. Now, it's most centrally located on the parent, the allied parent who adopts the role of the protective parent in the trauma reenactment narrative. But that additionally, that role of the protective other is adopted by ignorant and incompetent mental health people who are working through their own childhood trauma experiences. So they kind of become part of the false narrative, the trauma reenactment narrative, the delusional disorder, um, because they're captivated by their own trauma uh, processes and become collusive participants in the child abuse and then the spousal abuse. So today I'm going to explain where that comes from. And it's deeply unfortunate, but I run into a lot of these mental health people who are participants in the child abuse because of their own countertransference, it's called. So, to begin with, the pathology that we're talking about in the family courts is a type of trauma pathology. It's called the transgenerational transmission of trauma. So it's the movement of trauma through generations, and the way it moves is through the pathological parenting or pathogenic parenting that's created by child abuse. So you abuse a child, they grow up and they become a problematic parent who then passes that trauma on to the next generation. So the pathology in the family courts is the intergenerational transmission of attachment pathology from the allied pathological parent to the child. And it's mediated by the personality disorder pathology of the allied parent that is the result of their own child abuse. And so it's kind of a nice little package there where the trauma is moving across generations. The nature of the transgenerational transmission is that there's two sets of representational networks that get activated in the brain of the person. One, this is the allied parent. One is from the past, their own childhood trauma experiences, in their own development, and those are sitting back in their brain networks as called internal working models of attachment. And with the divorce, those get activated again because the attachment system mediates loss, grief and loss, and everything about attachment. So with the divorce, those previous patterns of the past, their internal working models that are in the pattern of victimized child, abusive parent, and protective parent, all those representational networks from the past get activated. In addition, they have the current representational networks for the current people, the current child, the targeted parent, and themselves as the allied parent. And so, what happens with the divorce is you have these two brain networks in the attachment system, both active, one from the childhood trauma and one from the current relationships. And the concurrent activation of two sets of representational networks, one from the past, one from the present, in the attachment networks of the pathological parent, creates a fusion, a psychological equivalency of these two networks because they're both getting activated at the same time. And so they kind of merge. And so what happens is the fusion of the past and present in the psychology of the pathological parent. The current child becomes a victimized child. The targeted parent becomes the abusive parent, and the allied parent then takes on the role of being the protective parent. Now, these uh, roles here are false. They're a factitious pathology because what we really have is just a child, parent, and parent. It's not. There's no abuse going on, but the labels abuse and victimized and protective, those all get added from the unresolved trauma. And so what you're looking here right here in this picture is the persecutory thought disorder. That's the persecutory delusion right there. because the reality is it's just parent, child, parent. But the delusion is coming from their own unresolved trauma that adds the victimized and the abusive and protective. And it's that victimized child role, which is the delusional thought disorder, that the child is being malevolently treated in some way. No, they're not. It's just a normal child. And so it's that discrepancy on the current child and victimized child that is the delusional thought disorder. And it's imposed and it's shared because it's coming out of the pathological parent. So what happens with this pathology, the transgenerational transmission of trauma, is there's a fusion, a psychological fusion in their minds regarding the past and the present. And so they get confused and they lose boundaries on what's current and what's not. And the current child then becomes the victimized child. The targeted parent becomes the abusive parent, and the allied parent, and this is the critical issue, the allied parent then takes on the role of the protective parent. And that's a critical role for them to fulfill in working through their own trauma, childhood trauma. So all of this is a reenactment narrative and story so that they can fill that protective parent role. That's the role they want to fill in their own trauma reenactment, because that'll help them resolve their own past childhood trauma. And so we have a false trauma. That's your factitious disorder. Okay, it's a false narrative. It's not child abuse. There's no PTSD. No, that's a false factitious disorder. It's the persecutory delusion. It's the merging of the past and the present that creates this false attachment pathology. So the current victimized child, that is a key role in understanding how the pathological parent creates the false disorder, okay, the factitious disorder, the shared delusion. Because the moment that the allied parent can get the child to believe the child is being victimized, that the child is being malevolently treated in some way, the moment the child drops into that victimized child role, that automatically defines the targeted parent as being abusive. Because if there's a victimized child, there must be an abusive parent, right? So just by getting the child to believe they're being victimized will then make the allegation of abusive parent against the targeted parent, which will then allow the allied parent to swoop in as the supposedly protective parent. So the other two roles, the abusive parent and protective allied parent, can be generated from simply creating the supposedly victimized child, that persecutory delusion in the child. The moment the child believes they're being malevolently treated in some way, that we need an abusive parent, that becomes a targeted parent, and we get a protective parent role. And that, again, that protective parent role is key to working through that unresolved trauma for that parent. Okay, so they are recreating their own trauma narrative experience, but adding a different quality to it as a way of processing their own unresolved trauma. And so what they're doing is they're confusing psychologically the past and the present. They're having a lot of feelings come up about anxiety and various things from past trauma, but they're attributing those feelings to the current situation that's not accurate. And so they're getting confused as to what's past and what's present, and because everything's going on at the same time in their attachment networks. So psychologically, for the protective allied parent, if we just go into their psychological place, so they are the protective allied parent for this supposedly abusive narrative out here. Now notice I kept the past child and past parent gray because they're in the past. There's no abuse going on, but there's a false abuse narrative coming out of the unresolved trauma of the allied parent, but there's no actual abuse going on in the situation. And psychologically, the current child represents the allied parent as a child. They were abused as a child, and now they have this current child who's abused and they again fuse over. And so they are protecting themselves as a child, and so it starts to get really kind of squirrely inside their representations. Is it them? Is it a child? But it's because of this fusion of past and present. So they are protecting themselves, and so it becomes a very almost obsessive compulsive, their need to protect the child. And then the childhood abusive parent of the current allied parent. So when they had their childhood trauma and their own abusive parent, that now becomes the targeted parent. And so they become the supposedly abused child. The targeted parent becomes the abusive parent to them. And now in their own childhood trauma, the allied parent never had a protective parent. And that's the fundamental issue. That's the problem. They were abused and nobody came, nobody protected them. And so what they're seeking for the resolution is that protective parent role that they never received. And so that's why it's so critical for them to adopt this role. That's what this whole thing is about, is to allow them to adopt that protective parent role relative to the abusive parent, relative to the supposedly victimized child. And so now they're here now to protect the supposedly abused child that they never had in the past. So what we will see with this pathology is very rigid roles. Let me pull this up again for a second, because this becomes valuable for assessment. When we're doing assessment on this, we can drop right in, or I can drop right in on the pathology and look at it directly. But there's a second way of exposing it. It's called response to intervention. If you start to try to do anything with it, you will encounter extremely rigid roles that they will not shift a bit, no matter what you do, no matter what reality is given to they're locked in, because this is a false trauma reenactment narrative that requires these roles. And one of them is the victimized child. Now, with normal range parents, if I actually have abuse situation, I've worked child abuse. All four forms: physical, sexual, neglect, all of them. And when we have an abusive situation and the authentically protective parent, when we can produce the abuse risk and stuff and change that normal range parent is ecstatic. They want that abuse to stop. They want their child to have normal range relationships. But in this pathology, the allied parent doesn't want that. So if we start to fix the situation, they will, no, we don't want that fixed. The solution is to reject the abusive parent. That's their own thing. That's their rejection of their own parent. And they will tolerate nothing else because they have to work through their own trauma. So here's a visual representation of what that looks like. The allied parent must maintain the protective role for their own working through of their childhood complex trauma, their attachment trauma. And this requires that there must be a victimized child. If they're going to be a protective parent, they need a victimized child. And so we absolutely will see them rigidly locked on to the child is being victimized, no matter what information they're provided with. That's not true. We do assessments, we look at no, but they believe the child is being victimized. And you will see a rigidly maintained desire, need to be the protective parent. And that can really be brought out in assessment interviews about their need to be a protective parent when there's no need for protection. And that's where we get the persecutory delusion. So this is the origin of the persecutory delusion right here, and the fixed and false belief in supposed victimization that the child is being malevolently treated in some way. So again, you're looking right there in that visual representation at the shared induced persecutory delusion, because the pathological parent needs the false narrative in red, but reality is the current child and targeted parent in gray. They're normal range people. This is just normal, but it's all a false kabuki theater from the past, and it's a psychotic. They're out of touch with current reality because they're living in the past. That's your delusional disorder. Now, here's the here's an additional difficulty on this pathology. And it has to do with the nature of attachment pathology. So let me explain that for a second again. Attachment pathology is not like ADHD or autism or eating disorders or any other thing we treat, because all of us have an attachment system. All of us have attachment traumas to a degree from our own parenting and childhood experience. The experiences of our childhood shaped how our internal working models of attachment, our expectations about love and bonding and the various things. And so all of us will bring our biases from our own family of history origins, just because all of us are going to bring our biases on the attachment networks. And for those of us mental health people who are bringing unresolved traumas somehow from our childhood that maybe motivated us to get into psychology to begin with, to work things through, and we're coming in with a little bit of our unresolved trauma, that unresolved trauma in the mental health person is going to resonate with the false trauma reenactment narrative, and they're going to be seduced into adopting the protective other role, which is the working through. They're going to believe the persecutory delusion so that they can adopt the protective other role and working through their own trauma experiences about the victimized child and abusive parent. That's a false disorder. Okay, so it's called countertransference. And so here's the mental health professionals with their own unresolved trauma will psychologically join with the false trauma reenactment narrative to vicariously work through their own childhood trauma through adopting the role of the protective other. So you see those two blue circles. We have the protective parent there in their role, and the therapist comes and joins them to work through their own trauma, but notice there's no child abuse. The current child and targeted parent are not victimized or abusive. And so they're believing the shared delusion as if it was true. They're believing the red part without doing a proper assessment of reality to be able to diagnose the delusional thought disorder involved. So that becomes extraordinarily bad, because if the mental health professional believes a shared delusion, then they become part of the shared delusion. They become part of the pathology. And when the pathology is psychological abuse of the child by the allied parent, then the mental health person becomes part of the child abuse. And when the pathology is a spousal psychological abuse, of the targeted parent using the child as a weapon, then the mental health person becomes part of the spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. Now, that is incredibly bad. Okay, mental health people have duty to protect obligations, but here in the family courts, frequently we have the mental health people who are joining with the pathology to vicariously work out their own childhood traumas, which is why they came to the family courts, which is why they're over here doing this, working with this attachment pathology, is to work out their own attachment stuff. And they're believing the shared delusion to do that. So we have mental health people in the family courts who are active child abusers and active spousal abusers because they are believing a shared delusion. And the reason is they're not competent in the pathology. They're not competent in delusional thought disorders or attachment or factitious disorder or anything. They're lazy and ignorant and incompetent because they're not over here to solve things. They're over here to work through their protective other role over and over again, and how wonderful they are protecting children from child abuse when there's no child abuse. Okay, so that's a problem, significant problem. And so here's the DSM-5 diagnosis. Just to be clear for everybody out there, this is the DSM for what I just described there. Okay, that trauma reenactment narrative, all of that stuff. This is the DSM-5 diagnosis for all of that. So for the allied parent, it would be a delusional disorder, persecutory type, induced shared over with the child. That's a DSM-5 297.1. So we have the allied parent as the primary case in a shared delusional disorder. Then we also have a factitious disorder imposed on another for secondary gain to the pathological parent, manipulating the court, meeting their own needs. So that factitious disorder is a false attachment pathology. That's your false child abuse. They're creating a false attachment pathology that makes the allegation that that parent's being abusive of the child. So they're creating a false abuse narrative. That's your trauma reenactment narrative. But the way they're doing it is to create the delusional disorder in the child. So you got the two wrapped up together, the delusional disorder and the false attachment pathology. And either one or both of those is going to land on the child psychological abuse diagnosis. And that's the one we're going to act on. So we diagnose the pathology. And then for a borderline spectrum version of this pathology, I might tend to more towards the delusional disorder. For a narcissistic version of the pathology that's more Machiavellian manipulation and secondary gain, I might go for the factitious disorder as the primary. But both of them are going to be there. It's a package. And then what we wind up on the child psychological abuse diagnosis, which then guides our treatment interventions, protect the child and restore the child's healthy development. And then we also have a second dangerous pathology, which is spousal psychological abuse using the child as a weapon. And it is a brutal and savage form of spousal abuse. Basically killing the other person's child is like, wow, that's pretty savage. And so all mental health professionals have duty to protect obligations, and all mental health people in the family courts are failing in those at this point. So the child diagnoses, I would consider various things, but here's one pretty standard, would be an adjustment disorder with disturbance to emotions and behavior. They're having difficulty adjusting to the divorce, basically. And interestingly, adjustment disorder is in the trauma section of the DSM-5. And so this is transgenerational transmission is trauma that's creating the adjustment disorder. Then I would put a second of the factitious disorder imposed on another, the false attachment pathology. And I'd probably put that up. I could do it either way on the child, but the factitious attachment pathology is going to drive a lot of the treatment. But we also want to orient the child back to reality. But ultimately, we're orienting the child back to reality on the delusional disorder in order to fix the attachment pathology. We need to fix the attachment pathology. So that's factitious disorder imposed on another. Then the third diagnosis down would be delusional disorder, persecutory type, induced shared, DSM-5 297.1. Child is a secondary case, parent is a primary case. Some of these cases with high anxiety, typically the borderline spectrum version of this pathology, the child will meet DSM diagnostic criteria for a specific phobia, mother type or father type. That's an unrealistic thing. There's no such thing as a mother phobia or a father phobia. That's another factitious disorder imposed on the child, a factitious specific phobia. So, I'd put that as a rule out as I'm coming up with the diagnosis. Sometimes it applies, sometimes it doesn't. And then, but again, all of those wind up on the child psychological abuse diagnosis, which is going to be our treatment focus to resolve, protect the child and fix everything to get the child a normal and healthy childhood. So relative to the mental health people who are currently, let me pull this up and make this clear. Relative to the current mental health people, notice I don't call them professionals because I don't think they're operating at a professional level. I call them mental health people. And these people are currently participating in the child abuse, participating in the spousal abuse because they are misdiagnosing the pathology in the family. The reason they are misdiagnosing the pathology in the family is because they are practicing beyond the boundaries of their competence with both attachment pathology and delusional thought disorders and factitious disorders and family systems and personality disorders. Okay, so it goes way down a list. But if they got up to speed on just attachment pathology and delusional thought disorders and child abuse, 3 domains, then they'd be pretty good. Personality disorders, 4, I think, would be pretty solid competence. They have none of that, none. And so they are, because of that, they're getting captivated on their countertransference, and they believe this delusional presentation to them, and they become participants in the child abuse. The mental health people are child abusers and spousal abusers. And that is really bad, and they should lose their licenses, in my opinion, for their negligence, for their incompetence, for their laziness. They're just lazy. They don't learn it. If I have to explain the pathology to a mental health person, they're not competent by my needing to explain it to them. Okay, so that I should not have to explain the pathology to another doctor to have a professional level discussion. They should already know that's their obligation. I can cite this ethics code. 2.03 is maintaining competence. It's their obligation to learn and know the pathology, not my obligation to teach them. And it's definitely not your obligation as parents to teach the doctors what the pathology is, but you have to. And that just shows the abysmal level of professional competence in the family courts. And it's resulting in the mental health people participating in the child abuse. So we have mental health people who are child abusers and spousal abusers in the family courts, and no one's doing anything about it because everybody's doing it in the family courts and nobody cares on the outside. You've been abandoned, basically, and that has to do with the pathology as well. So for the competence, just to reiterate this, the required domains of knowledge necessary for competence in court-involved custody conflict are attachment pathology. It's a problem in the love and bonding system. That's the attachment system. You have to know how it operates and how it doesn't. It's motivational system. Always motivates in one direction. If it flips motivation, that's child abuse. Is it a authentic attachment pathology or a factitious attachment pathology? It's a motivational system. You need to know about delusional thought disorders. What I just described there, the past and the present kind of merge, and you have persons out of touch. The allied parent is out of touch with current reality because they're imposing their own trauma stuff from the past. You need to know about child abuse and complex trauma because that's a differential diagnosis. It's going to either be child abuse by the targeted parent creating the flip in the child's attachment motivation, or it's going to be psychological child abuse by the allied parent creating a false, factitious attachment pathology that mimics child abuse. So one way or the other, it's going to be a child abuse diagnosis. So the mental health people need to know about child abuse and trauma. Personality disorders. Oh my goodness, we have narcissistic borderline dark personalities in the family courts. Narcissists are vulnerable to rejection, divorce. Borderlines are vulnerable to abandonment, divorce. Dark personalities are narcissistic, psychopathic, and Machiavellian levels of manipulation. There's your secondary gain for creating the false pathology in the child. They're creating the secondary gain of manipulating the court's decisions. You add sadism to that, you have the dark tetrad. The book and colleagues in the research on the dark personalities called the dark triad and dark tetrad the core of evil. We have personality pathology in the family courts that is research defined as the core of evil. Is anybody know about that? Is anybody doing anything? We need to get active on solving the pathology in the family courts. This is child abuse, this is spousal abuse. It's going on, it's active, it's unresolved. We need to get knowledge about factitious disorders. We need to know about true authentic attachment pathology as well as false factitious attachment pathology. And you need to know about family systems. You're treating a family conflict. You need to know how families work if you're going to be working in the family courts. So those are the domains of competence necessary. I can pretty much guarantee you I can go through any vita of any court-involved mental health professional and not find any of those. None of those. But they need all of them. I don't care if they got one or two. They need all of them. What makes you think ignorance is okay? The court holds the lives of these children in their decision. The court's decision is going to have a massive impact on these children. And you as a mental health person think ignorance is okay? You just don't need to know a whole lot, just a little bit. No, you need to know everything you need to know so that you can get an accurate diagnosis and effective treatment plan and protect the child, protect the spouse, protect whoever needs protection in this situation. You need to know what you're doing. And if you don't want to know what you're doing, go somewhere else. Go work autism, ADHD. Because if you're coming to the family courts, that is the domains of knowledge that you need to figure out you need. Okay. And it's not my obligation to teach you, it's your obligation to already know. So, with that, that's going to wrap up my Sunday talk this week about the protective other role. And you'll notice that protective parent role for the allied parent is very characteristic and very distinctive. And if you don't challenge it, if they just come in and to play that role for you, and you just buy into it and say, "Oh, you're such a wonderful parent," there's your Factitious. "Oh, you're such a wonderful parent for protecting your child," and "Oh, I'll join you over," and you don't challenge it, you don't see that it's rigid, it doesn't move. You can that protective parent role. You don't need to be a protective parent. Yes, I do. No, you don't. Yes, I do. And that's where you get the interview that gets the thought disorder, the mental status exam, because they are so need that protective parent role that contrary evidence just drops off and falls to the floor, and it becomes pretty obvious as you're doing if you know what you're looking for, this pathology just jumps out like neon lights. And so it's pretty, when people say it's complex, saying, "Oh, it's a complex," but not if you know what you're looking for. Yes, transgenerational transmission is going through several generations. It seems complex, but it's pattern. It always does the same thing. And so once you recognize the pattern, you'll see the patterns. So with that, I'm going to head off to my Sunday, and good luck to everybody out there. And we'll check in with you next week on some other aspect of the pathology.